My husband's affair wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that my family already knew. The woman he'd been sleeping with wasn't a stranger. It was my sister. I didn't find out because I was suspicious. I found out because Daniel forgot to log out of an old tablet he thought was broken. I was looking for photos for our anniversary when I saw the notification. Hannah's name. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Then I opened the messages. They weren't recent. They were from 2 years ago. 3 years. 4. The timeline overlapped with our entire marriage. But the physical sickness I felt wasn't from the cheating. It was from the silence. At dinner the week before, my parents had asked about our trip. Hannah had smiled and asked if Daniel was working too hard. They all looked at me with pity disguised as concern. They knew. Every smile, every hug, every family gathering while my marriage was rotting from the inside. They knew. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the tablet. I just sat there on the kitchen floor and let the truth settle. Anger would have required energy I wasn't willing to give them. Instead, I felt something colder. Clarity. I closed the messages. I logged out. And I started planning how to remove them from my life, one by one. Because betrayal is painful, but being treated like you're too weak to handle the truth is insulting. And I was done being insulted. My name is Elena, and at the time I found those messages, I had been married to Daniel for 8 years. I was in my early 30s, settled into what most people would call a stable life. We had routines, shared accounts, inside jokes, and a version of love that had grown quieter, but still felt dependable. I wasn't naive, and I wasn't insecure. I trusted him because nothing in my daily life suggested I shouldn't. If anything, I had built my identity around being steady, the one who kept things functioning, the one who handled practicalities before they turned into problems. I didn't thrive on drama. I preferred order. I believed that if something was wrong, it would show itself eventually. That belief wasn't blind optimism. It was habit. In my family, I had always been the composed one. Hannah was louder, warmer, easier to rally around. I was the reliable one, the daughter who showed up early, stayed late, and didn't need reassurance. Over time, that dynamic shaped how people treated me. They assumed I could handle things. They assumed I didn't need protection. And apparently they assumed I didn't deserve honesty either. Looking back, I realized the signs were there. Not obvious enough to accuse anyone, but subtle enough to make you uneasy if you paid attention. The problem was I trusted the wrong people to tell me when something was broken. And they chose silence instead. Daniel's work travel started gradually. At first, it felt reasonable. Promotions bring responsibility. Responsibility brings travel. I didn't question it. He would mention meetings out of town, send quick photos from hotel lobbies, complain about delayed flights. Everything looked normal on the surface. But over time, the trips became more frequent and less detailed. He stopped volunteering information. If I asked how the meeting went, the answers were shorter. If I asked when he'd be back, the timing shifted slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just small inconsistencies that didn't quite align. The emotional distance was harder to ignore. It wasn't coldness. It was distraction. He would nod while I spoke, but miss the point of what I'd said. He forgot small things he used to remember. When I reached for him at night, he felt present physically, but somewhere else mentally. I told myself marriages evolve. Passion quiets. People get tired. I adjusted expectations instead of confronting questions. That's what steady people do. There were moments that flickered in hindsight. A work trip that overlapped strangely with Hannah's unexplained weekend away. A group dinner where Daniel and Hannah shared a look that lasted a second too long. I noticed it, then dismissed it. Because your brain resists conclusions that would fracture your life. It's easier to assume coincidence than betrayal. Have you ever sensed something was off but convinced yourself you were imagining it? That subtle tension in your stomach that you talk yourself out of because the alternative is too disruptive? That was me. I wasn't blind. I was choosing stability over suspicion. And the people who knew the truth counted on that. When the travel became routine and the distance became normal, I stopped asking questions out loud. But internally, I began observing. Not accusing. Just watching. The problem with quiet observation is that when the evidence finally arrives, it doesn't shock you. It confirms what you were afraid to articulate. And confirmation changes everything. The discovery didn't happen during a dramatic confrontation or a late-night argument. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through old devices we planned to donate. The tablet had been sitting in a drawer for months, screen slightly cracked, battery unreliable. I powered it on to wipe it before resetting. I wasn't looking for evidence. I was looking for storage settings. When it connected to Wi-Fi, notifications flooded the screen. Most were outdated system alerts. One wasn't. Hannah's name appeared at the top. I remember pausing, thumb hovering over the screen. There was nothing inherently suspicious about her name. She texted Daniel occasionally about family events. But the preview message wasn't about birthdays or dinners. It was intimate, familiar in a way that didn't belong between a brother-in-law and a sister. I opened the thread. The messages didn't start recently. They went back years. Casual at first. Shared jokes. Gradually shifting tone. Private language. References to hotel rooms. Screenshots of flight confirmations. A photo I recognized immediately, not because I had seen it before, but because I knew the setting. Daniel had sent me a nearly identical one during a conference trip. Same city. Same weekend. Different recipient. I didn't scroll frantically. I moved through the conversation methodically, absorbing dates, cross-checking memories. There were messages sent minutes after he'd texted me goodnight. Plans coordinated around his travel schedule. Emotional exchanges that stretched far beyond physical encounters. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a parallel relationship. Then I saw something that tightened my chest more than anything else. A message from Hannah. Your family will never find out. Your family, not our. The phrasing mattered. The thread continued for pages. Arguments. Reconciliations. Plans to be careful. Mentions of my parents asking questions. Subtle acknowledgments that others were aware. That's when the betrayal multiplied. It wasn't just that Daniel had chosen my sister. It was that the secrecy wasn't limited to the two of them. There were references to conversations I had never been part of. They're worried she'll overreact. It's better she doesn't know yet. I read those lines twice, then 3 times, because my brain needed repetition to accept what it meant. I wasn't discovering an affair. I was discovering an arrangement. I sat back against the couch and let the room settle around me. The house felt the same. The furniture hadn't moved. The light through the window hadn't changed. But something fundamental had shifted. The version of my life I believed in no longer matched reality. And once that gap opens, you can't close it again. The first shock was the betrayal itself. The second was the duration. I opened my calendar on my phone and began cross-referencing dates. Trips Daniel had taken. Weekends he'd left early to catch a flight. Holidays when he'd claimed urgent client meetings. As I moved between the tablet and my own records, the pattern became undeniable. The affair hadn't begun during a rough patch. It hadn't followed a fight. It had started while our marriage was still steady, while we were still planning vacations, still discussing long-term goals, still attending family dinners together, as if nothing underneath was shifting. 2 years. Then 3. It ran alongside birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings. It ran through seasons when I had been adjusting my work schedule to accommodate his travel, when I had reassured my parents that Daniel was simply busy building his career. Every memory began to feel unstable, like stepping on ground that might give way. I paused on one specific date, a weekend I vividly remembered. He had called me from the airport, apologizing for missing a small family event. Hannah hadn't attended that event either. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, the alignment felt deliberate. I scrolled further down the thread. There were arguments between them about timing, about guilt, about whether it was worth it. Those words struck harder than the physical details. Worth it implied calculation. It meant the damage had been weighed against the desire, and they had chosen to proceed. Have you ever looked back at ordinary days and realized they weren't ordinary at all? That while you were operating inside your understanding of reality, someone else had already rewritten it. The realization wasn't explosive. It was surgical. Each date I verified cut a little deeper, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. By the time I finished tracing the timeline, the narrative was complete. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't temporary weakness. It was sustained, planned, protected. And protection implies assistance, which meant this story didn't end with Daniel and Hannah. It extended further. And I already suspected where. If it had been a stranger, the damage would have been different. Still painful. Still humiliating. But different. A stranger doesn't share childhood memories. A stranger doesn't sit across from you at holidays. A stranger doesn't know your insecurities, because she grew up hearing them. Hannah wasn't just my sister. She was woven into the foundation of my life. We shared rooms when we were younger. We borrowed each other's clothes. We argued about trivial things and then forgot about them the next day. I had defended her more than once when extended family criticized her impulsiveness. I had explained her behavior away. I had believed that, regardless of personality differences, there were certain lines we would never cross. Reading through the messages, I saw references only she would understand. Inside jokes about family gatherings. Complaints about me that echoed conversations we'd had privately years ago. She wasn't just involved physically. She was participating emotionally. She knew exactly what she was dismantling. One message in particular stayed with me. Daniel had written, "She trusts us." The response from Hannah was simple. "She always has." Always has. That word carried more weight than anything explicit in the thread. It meant my trust wasn't incidental. It was assumed. It was convenient. Have you ever realized that someone's betrayal depended on your loyalty? That the very thing you offered freely became the thing that made it easier to deceive you? That was the part that hollowed me out. It wasn't rage I felt. It was distance. A quiet separation forming inside me, pulling me away from the version of my sister I thought existed. By the time I closed the tablet, I understood something clearly. I hadn't lost a husband and a sister in that moment. I had lost an illusion. And illusions don't survive exposure. I didn't confront them immediately. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted clarity before confrontation. I needed to know whether the references I'd read were assumptions or evidence. So I called my mother first, not to accuse, just to observe. I asked casually whether she'd noticed Daniel traveling more often. There was a pause before she answered. Not long enough to call out. Long enough to register. She said work had been demanding lately. I mentioned that Hannah seemed busy too. Another pause. Then a deflection. "You know how your sister is," she said lightly. "She doesn't always share her plans." I didn't mention the tablet. I didn't mention the messages. I simply listened. Later that evening, I drove to my parents' house unannounced. Daniel wasn't home. Hannah wasn't either. My father opened the door and looked surprised but not confused. That detail stayed with me. If my presence had been unexpected, his expression would have reflected it. Instead, he stepped aside and let me in quietly. We sat at the kitchen table. I placed the tablet on the surface between us and opened the conversation thread without explanation. My mother didn't gasp. She didn't demand context. She looked down and pressed her lips together. My father's shoulders dropped slightly, as if something he had been holding up was finally too heavy. "How long have you known?" I asked. The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My mother answered first. "We didn't want to hurt you," she said. "We thought it would pass." Pass. As if this were weather. As if my marriage were a seasonal inconvenience. "So you chose silence," I said. My father cleared his throat, but didn't argue. "We were trying to protect you." Protect me from what? The truth? Or the discomfort of addressing it? Have you ever realized that the people you thought would defend you decided you were easier to manage in the dark? That their version of protection involved withholding reality until it became irreversible? The affair was one betrayal. The silence was another. But what settled into me at that table was something colder. They had weighed my right to know against their desire to avoid conflict, and chosen comfort. And that choice told me everything I needed to understand about my place in the family. I didn't wait for Daniel to come home that night. I stayed at my parents' house until Hannah arrived. I wanted all three of them in the same room. Not for a dramatic scene. For alignment. I needed to see whether the story would shift depending on who was present. When Daniel walked in and saw me sitting at the kitchen table, his expression tightened briefly before smoothing out. Hannah followed a few minutes later, and for a split second, she looked startled. Then she composed herself the same way she always had when confronted with something uncomfortable, with practiced calm. I placed the tablet on the table again and slid it toward them. Neither denied it. Daniel exhaled first. "I was going to tell you," he said. It was the most predictable sentence in the world. "When?" I asked. He didn't answer. Hannah leaned forward slightly. "We didn't want to destroy everything," she said. "It wasn't supposed to get this far. Get this far." As if distance measured damage. My mother repeated her earlier line. "We were trying to protect you." That phrase felt rehearsed now, not protective. It was the family's consensus position: minimize impact, delay truth, hope discomfort dissolves. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't list sacrifices or plead for explanations. I asked one question instead. At what point was I supposed to matter in this? Silence answered me. Daniel looked at the table. Hannah looked at the floor. My parents avoided my eyes again. No one attempted justification beyond vague statements about confusion and poor decisions. No one addressed the duration. No one addressed the coordination. The lack of argument was more revealing than any defense could have been. Have you ever watched people scramble internally but refuse to admit fault out loud? That restrained discomfort in a room where no one wants to be the first to say they were wrong? I realized then that I wasn't going to get closure from their honesty. I was going to get it from my decision. And my decision was already forming. Didn't ask Daniel to leave that night. I left instead. Not dramatically. Not with raised voices or slammed doors. I walked into the guest room, packed a small overnight bag, and told them I needed space. No one stopped me. That detail mattered more than anything else. If they had believed I was about to make a mistake, they would have argued. They didn't. They let me go quietly, as if the separation had already been accounted for in their private conversations. Back at the house Daniel and I shared, the rooms felt unfamiliar. Not because they had changed, but because the context had. Every object now carried a double meaning. The framed wedding photo on the hallway wall wasn't sentimental anymore. It was evidence of parallel timelines. The dining table where we'd hosted holidays felt staged, like a set designed for a version of our life that hadn't existed in years. I didn't confront him further that night. I didn't need to hear more explanations. Explanations would have been attempts to dilute responsibility. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for a divorce attorney. The decision wasn't fueled by rage. It was logistical. Clear. The kind of choice you make once the emotional fog lifts and reality settles in. Have you ever experienced that moment where pain turns into procedure? Where heartbreak transitions into paperwork? It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels methodical. I gathered financial documents, account statements, and the details of our shared assets. I scheduled a consultation for the next morning. Daniel texted me later that evening. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. Conversation implies negotiation. There was nothing left to negotiate. The betrayal wasn't recent, and it wasn't accidental. It had been maintained deliberately, supported by silence. By the time I went to bed, I wasn't devastated. I was organized. And organization is the first step toward separation. The divorce process moved forward without spectacle. Daniel attempted apologies during the first week, messages that oscillated between regret and defensiveness. Hannah reached out once, not to apologize directly, but to explain how complicated everything had been. I didn't engage. Complexity is often just a softer word for choice. They had made theirs. I was making mine. Within a month, I finalized temporary arrangements and began looking for a new place. Relocating wasn't about escape. It was about clarity. Staying in the same environment would have meant constant reminders, shared streets, familiar restaurants, neighbors who asked questions. I didn't want to narrate my own betrayal repeatedly. I wanted quiet. Before I left, I met my parents one final time. Not to argue, to establish boundaries. I told them I would not attend family gatherings where Daniel or Hannah were present. I told them I would not participate in conversations that minimized what happened. I wasn't asking them to choose between children. I was choosing distance for myself. My mother cried softly. My father nodded, but said little. They asked for time. I told them time had already been taken, by secrecy, by delay, by silence. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger demands proximity. I was detached. Have you ever realized that forgiveness and access are not the same thing? I may eventually forgive the pain, but access to my life is earned by loyalty, not blood. When I drove away from that house for the last time, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Betrayal fractures identity. Boundaries rebuild it. Blood makes you related. Choice makes you family. And I was done being related to people who chose silence over me.